what else they will discuss and what will happen in the 2+2 also, which between the defense and foreign ministers.
It's a bit early to say, but I think both sides set their priorities. President Biden did talk quite forcefully about Ukraine, and then, of course, mentioned the need for India-US relations to deepen. I think Mr. Modi, Prime Minister Modi, made his stand pretty clear on that. He said that India was for peace, wanted hostilities to end, explained why India had to, in some senses, restrain itself because the Indians were living in Ukraine, pull them out, also brought succor to the Ukrainians by providing them medicine and everything else, and then talked about how we should continue to expand relationships with the US on various issues that were there.
And democracies coming together.
Absolutely. So I think they both set themselves up to discuss these things. There is a huge range of issues to be dealt beyond Ukraine. There are commitments that we are also seeking from the US, because when the Global Strategic Partnership was announced, there were critical areas of technology that they were supposed to deliver on. There was also, trade, which we still bedevils us. This meeting may not be about trade because you got the defense minister as well as the foreign minister here. But trade is one issue where we need to build trust on. They still have not given us the, given back the GSP, something like 2,000 goods that we have, $6 billion worth of trade. We haven't reached any agreement on that. And assurances on various other fronts, I think, is what we expect of this, a greater amount of trust and an understanding of India's position as to what we are doing in Russia and when we need to move. I think that's where
Let's come back to the Russian question, because that is top of the mind. Meera Shankar, India challenged at the moment. For how long can we play this neutral, independent role, given what we are seeing happening on the ground in Ukraine, massacres taking place of civilians? Can India continue to play this role of saying that, look, we want both countries to end the war, or can we openly declare Russia as the aggressor?
We have, if you've seen our statement on the UN on the massacre in Bucha, we have condemned it quite strongly and also sought an independent inquiry, because the facts have to be established in terms of what exactly happened. So we are not at the moment designating somebody as the country responsible for what has happened.
But do you believe that the Americans, will the Americans want more? Meera Shankar, will the Americans want more? Do the Americans expect us now to be very clear where we stand on this war?
Let me say that the US would certainly like us to be more aligned with their policy on Ukraine. But at the same time, US officials, while giving testimony in Congress, have shown understanding of India's position, because they understand that there is a historical context to India-Russia ties and a current situation where 60% of our defense equipment is of Russian origin. With Chinese troops mobilized on our borders, I think that puts us in a very, very sensitive spot. So for India, I think we will have to navigate between the two and see how we can, improve the situation, because we would really like the fighting to end. It's put pressure on all the developing countries. It's put pressure on the global economy, just as it was coming out of the pandemic.
We want the war. I'm going to stop you for a moment, because we want the war to end, and the Prime Minister has reiterated that, but at the same time, we seem unwilling to go and directly condemn the Russian aggression, which perhaps the United States wants us to do. Michael Kugelman, is that what the US expects? India to take sides in a war at the end of the day, which we didn't start, we are not part of. Why should we be part of America's intention to encircle Russia with economic sanctions, given the strong relationship that India enjoys with Russia?
Yeah, so thanks for having me, first of all. I think there's several reasons why the U.S. is particularly intent for India to take a stronger stand here. Now, we know that India's policy here is not new. It's never condemned Russian aggressions. But this time is a bit different because, one, this aggression is especially egregious. It's one of the most egregious aggressions in recent decades anywhere. Secondly, the U.S.-India relationship has come very far. It's never been stronger. So I think the expectations are very high from the Biden administration. And third, the Biden administration places an emphasis on democracies and democracy promotion and democracies working together to push back against Russia. So that's where India comes into play here as well. But that said, I think the US recognizes there's only so much it can do to get India to change its position and that it won't change its position. So I think that what we can expect the conversations to be like at the 2+2, at least from the US side, is for the US to be focusing India's attention not now, but on the longer term, where it will likely make an argument that Russia will increasingly be an unreliant or less reliant security partner for India because it'll be sanctioned, it'll be cash-strapped, it'll lack the ability to produce weaponry and supply it to India as it has in the past.
But will the United States, sorry to intervene, Mr. Kugelman, will the United States reach out and say, no, we will supply the equipment that the Russians want? The Russians account for a vast proportion of India's defense needs at the moment. Various figures, but they clearly, they are our most enduring, durable defense partner. Is the United States willing to, for example, tomorrow provide us with a nuclear submarine?
That's exactly right. I mean, that's an argument that can only be persuasive if the U.S. has something to offer in return. And at this point, it does not in terms of weaponry. Now, with non-arms, if you're talking about oil, for example, India, of course, relies on Russian oil much less than it relies on Russian arms. And if the U.S. has already been supplying a lot more oil to India than it used to. In fact, India was a top destination for U.S. oil exports last year. The U.S. can provide a better offer with cheaper oil to India. I think it could have a very strong argument there to say, well, look, you shouldn't be importing Russian oil because you can get it from us. We're not there yet, but it's a lot different with arms for the reasons you mentioned, because India is so much more reliant on Russian arms than it is on Russian oil and other non-security related goods. So it'll be a hard sell for Washington for sure to convince India to wean itself off of Russian support anytime soon.
Raymond Vickery, do you believe that the choices are as stark, or do you believe there is a middle ground? Why should India be within the US sphere of influence as Washington wants? Is it because we must see our future the next 30 years with the US? The United States continues to import uranium, as Raj Chengappa pointed out a little earlier on the show, from Russia, but expects India not to take cheap oil from the Russians.
I don't think it's a question of sphere of influence or whether or not you're within the U.S. coalition or not. I think the question for India is where it wants to go going forward and how it sees itself. Whether or not it sees itself as having interests which are worldwide and which are driven by its principles in regard to democracy, anti-imperialism, human freedom, or whether or not it looks backwards and says, well, this is something like the Cold War and we can just stay out of it. My view is that the situation has very much changed between the U.S. and India. We have strong ties now across the board, military, economic, people to people. But the basic change is that our values are now driving the relationship of anti-imperialism, anti-autocracy in regard to China. And it should be in regard to Russia, too. Russia shouldn't be exempted from basic principles that you don't invade a country and try to take it over and add it to your empire. So the old ways of thinking about this, it seems to me, are wrong. And I think that we have shown the great progress. Indian importations of arms have gone down from about 70% from Russia to about 50%. And there is great scope for working together in regard to defense missiles across the board, submarines, and all that. That's the reason we're having a 2+2. That's the reason the defense minister and the secretary of defense are involved here. So
let me take what you are saying. You seem to suggest there's a qualitative difference in the relationship between the two countries, and that needs to be recognized. Meera Shankar, as someone who's been part of that dramatic change that's taken place between New Delhi and Washington over the last 10 years, do you believe the situation that the Ukraine war presents, in a sense, is the toughest test in a way of this relationship? We built a relationship with America now strategically through the Quad, Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. Can we have that strong relationship at the Quad level and yet then claim that we are independent when it comes to Ukraine? Eventually, as I keep saying, the Americans expect you to be within their sphere of influence.
Well, we are a strategic ally. We are a strategic partner of America, not an alliance partner, and there's a difference there. But yes, our relationship with the United States is really very substantive and far more broad-based than the relationship that we have with Russia, which is concentrated on security, defense and security, and in some of the other sectors such as nuclear energy or space. But the economic relationship with Russia, the people-to-people relationship with Russia, is certainly not that robust as we have with the United States. So the United States, I would say, is a more broad-based relationship and one where our convergences are very strong in the Indo-Pacific. But
the United States, but if it's such a broad-based relationship, the US expects India then to say that to the world at a moment like this, which India so far has been very reluctant to do, given our long stand. So we've got nostalgia at the nostalgia and practicality of our relationship with the Russians, and we've got this broad-based engagement with the Americans. Can we sit on the fence while we go on while we try and negotiate or navigate with both countries? Is that possible, given what Russia is doing in Ukraine at the moment?
Well, I think that India has a historical context with Russia, which has been a reliable partner for us, even in situations such as 1971, when the Bangladesh war was going on, where they used their veto in the UN Security Council on India's behalf.
Well, that's 50 years ago, ma'am. With due regard, we keep going back to 1971. We are in 2022.
Yes, I do agree that there's a difference, because in the Indo-Pacific, you may have a more complex situation, since Western sanctions have pushed Russia much closer to China. Therefore, their reliability in future does come into question.
You know, given what you've said about China, China is the elephant in the room at one level. It is the rising power of the 21st century. And Dilip Singh, the US Deputy National Security Advisor, apparently said that, what do you expect if tomorrow China were to, God forbid, invade into India territory? What would you expect the Russians to then do? What would you expect the US to then do? Are these choices that we must make now, or can we push them to the future and say, look, we have this broad-based engagement with the Americans. Let's work together on these issues. We'll deal with China, Russia, Ukraine on a later date. Can we push it to the background, given the fact that the Americans expect us to take a stand now?
I'm not sure if some Americans might be doing it, but I think they understand also that there are two things I'd like to put on the table. One, I agree with some of the earlier panelists when they say that we need to work out the trajectory. The trajectory is pretty clear when it comes to US relations. We are heading towards that, right? It's pretty clear, the shift that we have made, the deeper engagement that we've had with the US. Never before Meera Shankar was ambassador at her time, and now when you compare what has happened, we've gone a huge distance on various things. There's convergence on climate change, for instance. There's convergence on critical technologies, and there's convergence on China that we're about to discuss. Now, if you take a look at China, the Indo-Pacific arrangement doesn't doesn't really work in terms of Quad, in terms of a military thing. That's largely at the moment economic from our side, because the moment America brought in AUKUS, which is combining with Australia and this thing, that they were taking charge of that particular aspect of it, which to India suited us. But essentially, China for us is a continental war. It's land that we are looking at, right? We are not fighting China on the seas. So there we need the kind of equipment to tackle China, and America at the moment is not giving us that. If you take a look at that, why would we break completely with Russia at the moment when we see, firstly, we are highly dependent on them. Secondly, this war is not of our making, as we said earlier. Thirdly, the consequences of the war is hitting us very hard. While the US makes all these statements about, don't buy oil from them and others, buys uranium at this time. 16% of the uranium is dependent on Russia. Europe is doing that, and they talk about, let's balance the shocks out, let's ease it out. We can say the same kind of things that's there. And when you look at the entire battle that is going on in Russia over there, we were not part, as we said. Europe took its decision to arm Ukraine to the extent that Russia felt threatened. These are things that we can debate differently. But at the moment, we are. Does it mean that Putin is out? Of course, the war has not gone according to plan. But I think in the next 2 weeks, it's going to be pretty decisive. At the Eastern Front, it's going to be bloodier. And whether Putin comes out the worst or whatever it is in the kind of economic sanctions, we need to then decide where to move forward on this matter.
So we're not in a 24/7 breaking news mode where we have to
at the moment, you still require Russia. They could be helpful in countering China. Why do we discount that particular fact?
Michael Kugelman, as Raj Chengappa is pointing out, every country looks at war from their national interest perspective. And our national interests at the moment lie in being as independent as possible. We have a relationship with Russia in areas of defense and energy, which cannot overnight be dismantled. Does Washington recognize that? Do you believe Washington will respect India more for taking this seemingly neutral, independent stand?
Certainly Washington recognizes that. And I think there is a very important point that I think you mentioned. A lot of these Russian arms that come to India are used by India to strengthen its capacity to deter China, which is exactly what the U.S. wants it to do. And I think that could be a good argument, perhaps, for the U.S. giving a waiver to India for its S-400 acquisition. But look, I think my sense is that India's interests are not served by a prolonged war in Ukraine, right? The longer the war drags on, the more likely it is that Russia will edge closer to China. That is not something that India wants. India also does not want the US and the West to be sidetracked from the issue of China with all this focus on Russia. So one thing that I think could work very well, though it may be controversial, is for the US and the West, instead of trying to push India to end its neutrality, try to suggest that India play the role of a third-party mediator. India has this special relationship with Russia. It has a good relationship with Ukraine. Why not be that actor that puts itself out there to push both the Ukrainians and the Russians to de-escalate and end the war? That would, I think, allow India to maintain its neutral position. Its neutrality would be an asset, not a liability in that context. It could help ease potential tensions with the US if India is able to do that successfully and move the needle forward towards de-escalating. And I think that that's a more realistic thing for the US to look for from India than for India to suddenly change its position and condemn the invasion and criticize Putin. That's just not very realistic, in my view. I understand India may not be comfortable playing that role, but Prime Minister Modi has said, including in his brief remarks today, that he has asked Modi and Zelensky and Putin to speak. So it's almost like he's trying to put himself out there. I think that's a more realistic position for the U.S. to take. Look to India as a third-party mediator. Don't try to get it to align with the West, because it's just not as realistic.
Raymond Vickery, do you really think India has that kind of heft to play the role of a mediator in this war? So far, the Russians are moving to their own strategic objectives in Ukraine. Should India just stay out? India at the moment wants to stay out till we know what the next few weeks, how the situation unfolds on the ground. Why should India be pushed into any corner?
Well, I think that this goes back to my point that peace, like war, must be waged. It is not something that just happens. After World War II, we put into place institutions worldwide to try to keep the worldwide peace. Now, sure, there have been things which have happened, but there has not been major war. And what we're talking about here is the possibility of major war. We're talking about whether it escalates into nuclear weapons that could kill 35 million people in the first couple of hours. We're talking about India being subject to radiation from this. And you have to look at it in terms of how India is going to play a role in waging peace. Now, maybe India can do something in terms of being activist in trying to bring this to a close. But India needs to decide, it seems to me, that its interests are not just in defending land borders against China. It's not just in being able to get its position in Kashmir, that it has a broader role, that India is, in fact, has emerged as a great power and needs to act like one. That's what's at stake here. It's not a question of whether or not in 1971 something happened, or whether or not India, when it first became independent of the British Empire, needed to take a different stance. It's a question of what's in India's interest in the world today. And if there were ever an example of trying to trample on the institutions that have been put together to keep the peace, it is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is not something like President Trump would say here domestically, well, there are good people on both sides and we just need to work our way through. There are certain principles, and one hopes that India will recognize that in addition to all of the interests which it has vis-a-vis China, in terms of the economic interest, in terms of the movement of peoples, all of those things, that this is an interest, and it's not a time just to stand aside and abstain from voting or saying, oh, well, we need some oil here, we need cheap arms. And the U.S. and India need to be able to work together on that basis to be able to have a world order which will sustain the national interest of both nations.
You know, obviously there are those who will argue there's very little morality in international politics. Every country looks at situations from their own narrow national interests. Let's just listen into Prime Minister Modi, because Prime Minister Modi also spoke about the sort of the democracies of the world coming together at a time like this. Just let's listen in a bit to the Prime Minister, and then I'll get Raj and Meera Shankar to respond. Listen in.
प्रेसिडेंट बाइडेन, सबसे पहले मैं आपके गर्मजोशी भरे शब्दों के लिए आभार प्रकट करना चाहता हूं। आज हमारे रक्षा और विदेश मंत्री कुछ देर बाद 2+2 फॉर्मेट में मिलेंगे। उससे पहले हमारी यह मुलाकात उनकी बातचीत को दिशा देने के लिए महत्वपूर्ण है, और इस वर्चुअल मुलाकात का इनिशिएटिव आपने लिया, इसके लिए भी मैं आपका अभिनंदन करता हूं। एक्सेलेंसी, आपने अपने कार्यकाल के शुरू में ही एक बहुत महत्वपूर्ण स्लोगन दिया था, डेमोक्रेसी कैन डिलीवर। भारत और अमेरिका की पार्टनरशिप की सफलता इस स्लोगन को सार्थक करने का सबसे उत्तम जरिया है। इस साल भारत अपनी स्वतंत्रता की 75वीं वर्षगांठ मना रहा है, और हम अपने डिप्लोमेटिक रिलेशंस की 75वीं सालगिरह भी मना रहे हैं। मुझे विश्वास है कि भारत की अगले 25 सालों की विकास यात्रा में अमेरिका के साथ हमारी मित्रता एक अभिन्न अंग रहेगी। एक बार फिर आज के आयोजन के लिए आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। आज की हमारी बातचीत ऐसे समय पर हो रही है जब यूक्रेन में स्थिति बहुत चिंताजनक बनी हुई है। कुछ सप्ताह पहले तक 20,000 से अधिक भारतीय यूक्रेन में फंसे हुए थे और इनमें से अधिकांश युवा छात्र थे। काफी मेहनत के बाद हम उन्हें वहां से सकुशल निकालने में सफल हुए। हालांकि एक छात्र ने अपना जीवन खो दिया। इस पूरे घटनाक्रम के दौरान मैंने यूक्रेन और रूस दोनों के राष्ट्रपतियों से कई बार फोन पर बातचीत की। मैंने न सिर्फ शांति की अपील की, बल्कि मैंने राष्ट्रपति पुतिन को यूक्रेन के राष्ट्रपति के साथ सीधी बातचीत का सुझाव भी रखा। हमारी संसद में भी यूक्रेन के विषय पर बहुत विस्तार से चर्चा हुई। हाल में बूचा शहर में निर्दोष नागरिकों की हत्याओं की खबर बहुत ही चिंताजनक थी। हमने इसकी तुरंत निंदा की और एक निष्पक्ष जांच की मांग भी की है। हम आशा करते हैं कि रूस और यूक्रेन के बीच चल रही बातचीत से शांति का मार्ग निकलेगा। एक्सेलेंसी, हमने यूक्रेन में सिविलियन जनता की सुरक्षा और उनको मानवीय सहायता की निर्बाध आपूर्ति पर भी महत्व दिया है और जिसका अभी आपने प्रारंभ में जिक्र भी किया। हमने अपनी तरफ से दवाइयां व अन्य राहत सामग्री यूक्रेन और उनके पड़ोसी देशों को भेजी है और यूक्रेन की मांग पर हम शीघ्र ही दवाइयों का एक और कंसाइनमेंट भेज रहे हैं।
That was Prime Minister Modi in his virtual meeting with the US President. Therefore, looking ahead, Raj Chengappa, do you see India emerging stronger as a result of the kind of stand we've taken on Ukraine? Or do you believe this is we will sooner or later have to confront ourselves with the reality that this is not the Cold War era, this is a multipolar world where we are going to have to negotiate and navigate more astutely with each country?
Look, first things first, we do want peace. The war is hurting us as it is hurting the rest of the world. Second, can we mediate? I think Russia and Ukraine are directly in touch. There are more powerful powers that have stakes in those places that can mediate better, far better than what we can do. Third, in terms of taking a stand, I think this meeting with Mr. Modi, with President Biden, with Prime Minister Modi, is a good time to clarify the fog that has sort of enveloped our relations with regard to Ukraine, that our stands are clear. We have hardened our stand in terms of what Russia is doing there. We have not approved of that. In the beginning, we were ambivalent, but we've become clearer as we've been on the 12th statement, and we have gone far beyond what we are there. The fact is that we will have to move very carefully in this direction. This war is going to could take a very perilous turn. There could be nuclear issues. That's a different matter. But as it stands now, we need to tread that very difficult path that is there. While condemning what is happening out there, pushing for peace, we have to keep our interests in mind as well. But I think the direction is clear that we are heading towards the West. When to start doing it, they need to give us the assurance also that whatever Russia is doing for us, we would get that at some point.
Very quick final word, Meera Shankar. Do you believe that the statement of the Prime Minister reflects India slowly moving towards the position of the West, that what's going on in Ukraine is unacceptable? The Prime Minister spoke about the Bucha massacre. Are these slow steps? We abstained from the vote of throwing Russia out of the UNHCR. Russians wanted us to stand by them. That we are slowly but surely moving away from the Russians, the longer the war continues.
I think we never supported the Russian action. Let me make that clear. We said that a state should abide by the UN Charter, that there has to be respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. And we have urged that the violence be brought to an end and that negotiations and discussions be sought to find a way out of the conflict. So I think that our position has been fairly clear, and we have not supported Russia, and we have not supported the Western position either, We have tried to navigate a neutral position between the two. We don't think that it's helpful.
Can we keep doing that? Can we keep doing that? Was today the first sign that we cannot continue?
Let me finish my sentence.
Yes.
I think we believe it's not helpful to push Russia into a corner to prevent expansion of the conflict and its continuance. If we want Russia and Ukraine to negotiate and find respectful ways to end the conflict, then I think it's important not to push Russia or Ukraine into a corner.
Okay. On those words, I appreciate all my guests joining me. This is a story that will keep building up. Remember, there's a dialogue that will also take place between the defense and foreign ministers, 2+2 in Washington, D.C. Thanks very much for joining me, though, and giving us a sense of the difficulties that India faces in maintaining a neutral stand on the contentious issue of the war in Ukraine.